Hi there, Greg Dember. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Jonathan.
So we're talking because I came upon your wonderful essay in the Side View, which is a particularly fascinating collection of essays in this issue. And you wrote a piece called, I believe, What is Metamodernism and Why Does It Matter? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I read that. And I guess I wanted to do a few things in this discussion. One was get to know you a little better, kick the ball around a bit about what metamodernism is or isn't, maybe get my own bearings on that, share a little bit about how that concept has sort of come into my professional orbit, sensing that you've thought about it a great deal more than I have, so deferring to you largely, but also trying to tease out, based on what you say, what we might understand by metamodernism and the different schools of thought it contains.
Sure.
Let me start though by just asking a bit about you, Greg. Like,
Okay.
tell me, you mentioned you're in Seattle, but beyond
Uh-huh.
that, I know you're in Seattle. You've got a hat on, and you wrote this great essay, and I know you're on Twitter, and that's about
Okay.
it. So tell me anything else you can.
Okay. The hat is because I have quarantine hair.
Right.
Uh, so it's a remedy for that. Yeah. Um, and so who am I that wrote that essay? I should say I'm not a proper academic. So I got into writing on this academic topic of metamodernism in a kind of backdoor way.
Right.
My major in college was psychology, but I also took a lot of literary theory classes, and I always have kind of seen literature and the arts as a window into the human condition, kind of to go side by side with a more scientific way of inquiring about it. And I'm a musician and a songwriter, and just a kind of a big fan of music and film and popular culture. So I've always just kind of had an eye on what's going on. When I was coming up, postmodernism was kind of the prevailing sensibility,
Yep.
influencing culture, and we may get into exactly how we define
Yep.
that. And so, of course, if you're talking about postmodernism, you're going to ask the question, well, if postmodernism means after modernism, is there going to be a postmodernism or what all that? So I kind of always wondered that, and and with friends who I had discussions about this kind of thing with. Around the 2000s, I started noticing examples in indie rock music and in film and in fiction and everything like that that seemed to have like a kind of different sensibility that was different from postmodernism, and I was attracted to this work because it kind of had more room for the expression of the inner world,
Right.
and kind of unapologetic self-beingness,
Yes. Right.
if you will. And then meanwhile, my friend, I kind of call her my thinking partner, Linda Ceriello, we had an online magazine called Artocratic.
Right.
And we wrote and we had material from other people that our slogan was inquiry at the intersection of art, being, and I'm actually forgetting what the whole slogan was. But anyway, we had this discussion about postmodernism and all this stuff. And at some point, Linda discovered that there was a whole discourse using the moniker metamodernism to talk about the kinds of cultural artifacts that we were looking at. And so we just kind of got excited about that and shifted our focus and made a new site called whatismetamodern.com, where we wrote kind of just little analyses of different examples of what we thought were metamodern. And that was in 2013. And then Linda actually is an academic. She's in religious studies. And so by being connected with her, I've co-authored a chapter in a book where we looked at a particular film, The Cabin in the Woods, in relation to metamodernism. And then I've presented a talk at a conference about metamodernism. My talk was called Punk Rock for Sissies, and it was about metamodernism and indie rock, and things like that. So somehow that all led me to writing that article in the Side View, and here we are.
And now, sort of day to day, when you're not thinking about, is that mostly what you do, run the website, or do you have things you do day by day?
Oh, yeah, I make my living making custom software for small businesses.
This is good to know, because the internet's full of, fascinating perspectives, people who have different interests. Most people know me as a chess player, but day by day, I don't give any thought to chess really at all now. So it's good to know that you have a day job, you're grounded in that, but you still have this rich inner life and intellectual life trying to make sense of metamodernism.
Yeah, so that, what you just described, and then music are kind of my two projects.
Right.
Neither of which brings me income, but that's fine.
Sure. Okay, so let's get into this then. So I'm going to pretend to be relatively naive. It's not as though I haven't read anything. It's not as though I don't have opinions of my own. But just to try and elicit as much clarity as possible, I'm going to start from first principles.
Okay.
Before we get to metamodernism, can you give me some sense of even modernism, how you would begin to describe it? Then moving on perhaps to postmodernism as context before we speak about metamodernism. I know it's not necessarily sequential or chronological.
It kind of is.
That and while you're doing that, we've spoken about this a little bit online, but the ism aspect of that.
Okay.
Right. So see where we go, and we'll take it from there.
So should we get kind of nerdy with the?
Yeah, nerdy is good. Nerdy is fine. Permission to be.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go there. So I'm going to start with ism versus ity.
Okay.
Modernism versus modernity.
Yeah.
Which can be really confusing because both terms get used, and so I don't know that I could say everybody agrees on this, but a common way of distinguishing the term modernity versus modernism. Modernity is often used to describe the long period beginning either with the Enlightenment or after the Enlightenment, continuing all the way up until the present. And it's a big separation from what came before with industrialization and the rise of the nation state, and the kind of rise of like individual authors producing works, and of course the printing press making those widely available, and the kind of the modern bureaucracy, and this sort of just the general sense of people living through the mechanisms of society as kind of an equal part in their life to which of course what still continues, which is like connection to the earth and the natural processes of biology and life, so that's modernity.
To approximate that in years, I know that it's not as simple as a date to a date.
Okay, so we either the 17th or 18th, something, or in the 17th or 18th century, and we're still in it.
Right.
And you could almost kind of then look at it fractally. So then modernism is an intensification of that, beginning around the turn of the 20th century, maybe even in 1870 or such.
Right. That's very interesting. Something about the ism that arises as the ity matures.
Yeah.
Or gets overripe in some way. Okay, that's interesting. We'll come back to that.
So with modernism, you just get this much more focused interest in the new and in the capacity for humans to invent, quote unquote. I mean, now I'm going to say quote unquote around the word true, but they didn't.
Right.
To invent truer and more effective beliefs and notions and kind of universal truths that could be objectively revealed and discovered through science and logic.
Okay, got it.
And that was reflected in the arts,
Yeah.
with literature, with authors like Virginia Woolf,
Yeah.
and in music, with just like a real kind of break from the melodic traditions of the past with Schoenberg and the 12 tone and such. And quickly going through this to postmodernism. So the modernism is said to have begun maybe a decade or so before the turn of the millennium, before 1900.
Yes.
And then after World War II-ish, and this is all of these things are ish.
I know.
Yeah. After World War II-ish, a disillusionment with the enthusiasm for science and technology, partly, because of the results of the very high-tech war and the bomb, and then just kind of intellectual maturity. Philosophers and artists kind of took modernism, the skeptical lens of modernism, and turned it on itself.
Right.
And saw that, very modernistic sorts of belief systems or approaches to the arts were often leaving out contexts that they were either unaware of or in denial of or wanted to pretend they were unaware of. And so postmodernism was very preoccupied with context and with seeing the boundaries between things and questioning the boundaries between things, and making unheard voices heard. And then that kind of affected not just philosophy, but also literature and film and music. And then, say maybe a little bit before 2000, there's postmodernism maybe left people feeling dissatisfied because it kind of didn't have room for depth, and there was kind of like a constant return to irony and a kind of enforced embarrassment about earnest expressions and feelings. And so the theory is that metamodern work.
Before we get, because that's I can see that you're ready for that to say that now, but I want to just be sure where we are.
Okay.
You said something very interesting that I haven't really thought about before. I'm aware that through Zachary Stein principally, but I became aware that Habermas apparently views postmodernity, or perhaps postmodernism would be more precise in this context, as a kind of, an extension of modernism, or maybe it's truer to say that postmodernity is an extension of modernity. And I felt that now when you use the expression that modernity turned its own skepticism on itself, that the sort of the tools of inquiry, so modernity, the tools of science and technology and logic and reason and progress, suddenly they were inverted or looked back upon themselves and said, what do we think of ourselves? Where have we taken us? Where have we got to here? And the curious thing about that already feels quite meta, right? So we call it post, but the way you describe it actually sounds more like a meta move than a post move. I don't know how much that has to derail us, but for what it's worth, that's what I felt.
There's potential for derailment, like all along, because of these words and the prefixes. And at the risk of derailing things even further, I learned recently that in Greece, and probably in other, but particularly Greece, so post, I guess, is a Latin derived, and meta is a Greek derived prefix. And in contemporary Greek, as opposed to classical, meta means post.
Yeah.
That's their word for after, in a very, like, not even in a
Yeah.
scientific,
In a straightforward way. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
to say after, you say the word meta. And so they've been saying in their language, metamodernism,
To mean post.
everywhere that we say postmodernism.
Right, I see. I see.
So
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting backwater. Easily,
Um,
easy to add to the confusion.
so,
But
so yeah, but you said some things that have me having a few other kind of more relevant thoughts. Um, let's see. So, first of all, yes, postmodernism is, I view it as kind of a course correction for modernism.
right, right.
And or kind of, as I said before, fractal, like there could be no postmodernism without
Yeah.
modernism.
Yeah.
So
But should we
it's,
understand it? Because this is the thing I want to get a slightly better feeling for. That is postmodernism a kind of maturation or mm, extension of modernism in some way, or
I
is it
see
kind of
it that way.
critique of or a departure from or
I see it as a maturation based on a critique
right? Okay.
and using tools that come from come from modernism.
Right. Right.
Um, and I think the post mainly just means chronologically after.
Okay. Okay. And yet
Um,
really after, because somehow also within, right?
yeah,
Right.
I mean, and for me, when the way I think of the way these prefixes work is, if you have a word that's a prefix plus another term, there has to be a big part of that other term in the meaning of your new word.
Yes. 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 Yes.
So postmodernism implies modernism,
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Right.
right?
Right.
Um, and then the way meta is used in metamodernism, and I'm not sure you're ready to get there yet, but
No,
that
we are.
has twist too.
I think we're ready for that. Just let me double check, because I think one of the issues before you get into metamodernism is people not having fully processed what A, modernity and postmodernity are as
Right.
historiographical descriptions,
Okay.
B, what they mean in terms of the isms, which are sort of cultural reference points. And that's before you get into critical theory or architecture or any of the other ways of
Mhm.
looking at it. I even have a book at home called From Modernism to Postmodernism. Uh, and I began reading a book of intellectual history of the 20th century, in which he began the book saying that he described the 20th century as modernity. Now I know that there's a period
Mhm.
before that, but in his view, coming to terms with science was his way
Mhm.
of describing what modernity was. And so I'm aware that these are contested, blurred, vague, overlapping, and all of that. But nonetheless, just to feel way into it, modernity is something about reason, progress, trusting in rationality. In
Mhm.
some sense, it's a fairly um, pioneering or conquering kind of
Mhm.
mentality. And at some point, it runs out of steam to some extent, or at least it creates certain
Mhm.
problems.
It exhausts itself.
It exhausts itself in some way, right? And then
Yeah.
postmodernity comes in and says, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Have you seen it from this perspective? You've forgotten about women. You've forgotten about people of color. You've got your post-colonial critique, which is another
Mhm.
angle into this. And then
Yeah,
you've
and all of that, all of the post-colonial, and you've forgotten about marginalized
yeah,
groups. I think it's important to clarify that's only an aspect of postmodernism, and sometimes I think there are people who have latched onto that aspect
being
of
it,
it.
right, right,
Some who are pro, and many who are con,
right,
who
right.
have a problem with all of that, and the people who have a problem with the inclusive aspect of postmodernism, see it as this kind of villain that they have
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah. No,
fight against. But without, well, I mean, I am pro that the inclusion, but regardless of that, it's so important to say, like, you can have a postmodernism that's just very apolitical
right,
and
right.
concerned with very white male hetero
Right.
things.
So what would white male hetero postmodernism look like?
um Punk rock.
Right.
um if you take the hetero out, Andy Warhol.
Right, right.
Um, most of the literature in the second half of the 20th century.
Right. And it's characterized by, how would you describe that? It's a kind of irony or a knowingness. I mean, I know there's a famous quotation by Lyotard, right?
Uh-huh.
The defining feature of the postmodern condition, I think, is incredulity towards meta narratives.
Uh-huh.
And so anything that seeks to describe the whole looks absurd because people are like, well, there's only perspective, there is no
Mhm.
whole, right?
So it's an awareness of that,
Yeah,
and it's an interest in seeing the falsehoods that hide behind apparent truths.
right,
And irony is kind of a method used
right,
to show that, to reveal
right.
those kinds of things.
And the irony is sincere or not? The irony is, it's not there just to mock or play. There's a sense in which the irony is part of what's being described, right?
I think that, well, paradoxically, and I'm using paradoxically instead of ironically, because ironically gets used,
Yeah.
does too much work. So paradoxically, while postmodernism can be said to have something to do with an incredulity towards meta narratives, postmodernism has a meta narrative, which is the debunking of meta narratives.
Right.
And so it's very serious about that
Yeah.
project. I mean, now I'm personifying postmodernism, but you know what I mean?
Sure.
So we'll allow ourselves to do that. So it's very serious about using irony to debunk grand narratives, to debunk universal truth claims, to debunk the prevailing paradigm,
right,
and things, but then kind of at the expense of everything else.
right. Okay, so let me just catch up with this before we plunge into metamodernism.
Okay.
So I liked what you said earlier about when you describe a historiographical epoch, so you're using the language of modernity or postmodernity.
Well, do you mind if I, so at least for me, I use modernity to describe the big, long period starting in the 17th or
and
18th.
still with us today. Yeah.
So what they say, so modernism and postmodernism and metamodernism are all part of that.
All within modernity, right. So
Yeah.
for you, there is, so that's interesting. So for you, there is no historiographical reference. Postmodernity as a phase of history doesn't make sense.
It doesn't entirely make sense. I can kind of get it,
Right.
but modernism and postmodernism are the words for kind of the movements, the sort of umbrella movements encompassing movements in the various art forms and such,
right,
in the 20th century.
Right. But it's not true to say, for instance, that around the period I was growing up, between 1977 onwards, so let's say the 80s or 90s,
yeah,
these might be described. There was a lot of postmodernism around.
Yeah, I call that postmodernism.
Right. But you say that's still within modernity, not postmodernity.
Yeah, and that's me,
Right. So it's possible.
I'm not claiming that everybody uses the terms that way.
Somewhat differently. That's interesting, though. Okay, fine. But you did say something about the modernism arises within modernity. So it's like modernity kicks off, and at some point people begin to reflect on what this phase of history is, and the ism kicks in. And the reason that's interesting is that I was assuming we were going to say that we're now in a kind of historiographical epoch, sort of post 2000, with the impact of digital kind of penetration across the world, plus ecological sort of sensibility stroke collapse, a sort of financial globalization, a new sort of historiographical period of sort of planetization, in which we would say metamodernity has begun. And now that we're 20 years into that or so, and I know these are approximations, metamodernism is sort of ripening somehow. But I'm guessing you would say it's not quite like that.
Not quite like that, but it's not like that. And And I depart a little bit from the guys who kind of jump started the discussion about metamodernism, which is Tim
But yeah,
Vermeulen and Robin van den Akker.
yeah,
So their explanation for how metamodernism arose actually is pretty similar to what you said, that it's a response to current conditions.
right.
And while I don't deny that that's part of it, for me, I see metamodernism primarily resulting because of an exhaustion of postmodernism.
Yes.
Postmodernism exhausting itself, just in the same way that postmodernism arose as modernism exhausted.
Right. So it's the exhaustion of the exhaustion somehow.
Yeah.
Right. So
So, or it's the correction, you know, or I said that postmodernism was kind of a course correction for modernism,
right.
and then metamodernism is a course correction
Right.
for
So
postmodern.
to put this in slightly ridiculous language, but it's as if we were going to personify these ideas, it's as if modernism happens, it exhausts itself through various externalities, and various problems arise from modernism, and people notice that it's missing a lot of people left behind, marginalized and abused, exploited, whatever. And then it's like, okay, modernism has exhausted itself. Now we have to contend with the exhaustion. So there's a period of like where you're in the exhaustion. It's not just that something is exhausted, but there's a period of awareness in which this big project is somehow we're now in the exhaustion postmodernism. Yeah. But then it's like that. It's okay, guys. We've done enough of that discussion about the exhaustion of modernism.
Yeah.
Right. Now what do we do?
Yeah.
And that's where metamodernism comes in, right? I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And so what Vermeulen and van den Akker observed was, and I think they started in painting, but kind of quickly saw it in other areas. So they started seeing artworks that could not really be explained by the logic and theory of postmodernism. And what they were noticing was that these artworks, they used the term oscillated. These artworks were swinging between modernist sensibilities and postmodern sensibilities.
And that was the notion of metaxy. So it's a particular kind of meta, right?
Yeah. So they explain that their choice of meta as the prefix, it's not so much the way that most of us usually think of it, meta meaning sort of like beyond, above, something looking at itself. They're using meta as in terms of metaxy, which is
oscillation.
A term which is oscillation. Yeah.
But there's something more. It's not just oscillation. There's an emergent property from the oscillation, right? So it's the oscillation between modernism and postmodernism gives rise to, cooks something, if you like.
Yeah.
The oscillation creates an energy that gives rise to some different form.
Yeah. And so not that what I'm about to say is not part of Vermeulen and van den Akker's theory, and not that I'm the only person who's thought of it, but for me, I'm a lot more interested maybe than they were when they first wrote their first essay in kind of asking the question of what is the motivation, besides just explaining metamodernism in terms of modernism and postmodernism, what's the actual there that's intrinsic in metamodern works?
Okay. Right.
And my answer to that question is, if you view the history of these epistemes as a kind of term for these periods, so tradition, which is what the backdrop coming before modernism, if tradition, so all of these epistemes are kind of relate to how we know what we know, what our relationship to knowing is, usually unconscious. So tradition has to do with you know what you know because it's what your elders passed down, or what's in the sacred texts of your culture. And modernism, you know what you know because you or an expert figured it out using your great brain. And postmodernism, kind of accepts the modernist break from tradition, but it turns around and says, well, you're not as smart as you think you are,
Yeah.
Ms. Modernist. We have a lot of other context to consider.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and metamodernism, confronted with the kind of conviction of modernism and the relativism of postmodernism, metamodernism says, I can't really side with one or the other of those approaches, but what really matters is what I feel inside.
Right.
And I'm not going to let modernism's potential for reductionism to deny my interior experience.
Mhm.
And I'm not going to let postmodern's obsession with contextualizing everything and putting everything into relative terms, and its kind of fear of depth, its fear of getting caught believing in things.
Right.
I'm not going to let that kind of cast doubt on my interior experience. So for me, metamodern works do tend to oscillate between postmodernist and postmodernist sensibilities, with an emphasis on felt experience or interiority.
Mhm. So, okay, so what the thing I liked about your essay the most perhaps was this notion of metamodernism being about protecting our interiority at some level, or
Mm-hmm.
or claiming its own, making a status claim about the validity of the interiority of human beings, that it wasn't reducible to atoms and neurons or whatever, and it wasn't merely perspective. It wasn't merely about your culture,
Mm-hmm.
social condition, right? There's something unique, and also you seem to imply that there was something going on, that this is not necessarily a positive thing. In other words, the metamodern viewpoint, we shouldn't necessarily assume it's progress over
Right.
modernism or postmodernism,
Mm-hmm.
but it has a different character.
Yes.
So can you give me some examples of, problematics where something looks metamodern and yet doesn't look particularly desirable?
Sure. Doesn't look desirable to myself, at least.
Sure.
Um,
You're being
it,
postmodern there, right? If I may
yes,
say
I
so.
know, I know, I know. I mean, and that's the thing is,
Yeah.
well, just as an aside, I also resist people like declaring themselves, I'm a metamodernist,
Yeah.
or whatever, because I feel like if you live in today's age, you're going to have absorbed and at
Yeah.
various times inhabit these different perspectives.
Yeah.
So I mean, I have
So
the whole
no,
the
just
whole
yeah,
project.
I'm aware. I mean, there's no.
Yeah.
I know you're not exactly defending yourself, but I was joking, but just in the sense that if what characterizes metamodern sensibility is the sort of disposition to oscillate between
Mhm.
progress and perspective, or
Yeah.
um, something about the true and the
Yeah.
relative, then of course to be metamodern is to be one or the other at any given moment, depending on what's being
Yes.
said.
No, yeah, I was really glad you pointed that out. And I was just going to say another example of that is the whole kind of interest in this project of kind of breaking things down into periods and saying, this is this and that is very modernist.
Yes,
And
right,
I'm not embarrassed to claim that,
right,
that's a part of me too.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Um, so, okay, but back to your question. So in the essay that you read, one example that I go into a phenomenon that I don't favor, and probably a lot of people don't favor, is I feel like the alt-right in the United States has a lot of metamodern qualities.
Okay, interesting. Why is that?
Um, I guess you can get into that by asking the question, why is it the alt-right? Why is it not just the right? And from my reading of the alt-right, my understanding is first they were distinguishing themselves from the kind of conventional right, or what sometimes gets called paleoconservatives.
Mm-hmm.
So the right wing of their parents and grandparents, which they did not feel a connection to, because it was very formal and stuffy and kind of not a lot of fun, um, and didn't really have room for these younger right-wingers' interior experience.
Right, right.
And I think that for these young alt-righters, alt-right folks, a big part of what puts them on the right is that they feel that the left doesn't have room for their
Right,
interior
right,
experience.
right.
And I'm not sure how much they really care about the policy differences.
Yeah.
I think they just feel that, you know, and I'm not condoning it
I know, of
necessarily.
course not, of course not.
Yeah.
I understand that.
But I feel that they just don't see themselves reflected in the discourse.
Yeah,
And they wouldn't use the word discourse. That would, me saying discourse would alienate them, because
sure.
it, this, you know, and to them, postmodernism is about like every kind of people except themselves.
Right, right. So
Uh,
they see themselves as the vanguard somehow, the people who are moving history forward in the right way at some level.
um, I think they see themselves as course correcting,
Right,
um, and um, both against the conventional right and against what they would see as the postmodern left. Um, and as I understand it, I'm not an expert on this, but as I understand it, a lot of it started with Gamergate.
right, right.
Um, and it seems like, you know, if you look at what happened in Gamergate, the alt-right folks are kind of wrong, but I can understand their position maybe if I allow myself, which is that for them, gaming was just this private experience where they got to have fun and kind of be themselves. And what they objected to was it getting politicized
Right, right.
by what they end up calling social justice warriors, pejoratively.
Yeah,
And so you have this battle between the alt-right gamers, because no, not all gamers are alt-right, of course.
yeah,
But you have this kind of struggle between the alt-right gamers who are fighting just for kind of their own safe space in a way, like their own place to be themselves and have fun and have humor that is an expression of their interiority, without censorship and without, you know, you have a struggle between them, and then you have a struggle between the needs of, you know, women especially, and other marginalized groups,
right.
saying, you know, well, we've been treated badly and oppressed, and our concerns need to be
Sure.
addressed.
So so just to sort of distill that, you said in the paper, I would argue that while their behavior is frequently vile and degrading towards others, from their own vantage, they are engaging in ironic play, disrupting a hegemonic culture that leaves no room for their inner world.
Yes.
And elsewhere, you speak about, you know, the sense in which they're seeking fun, and you know, the way they orient themselves is that life is about their own inner space and how to have fun with that. Um, you know, which when put like that sounds innocent enough. When you consider what they do and think, it's altogether more threatening.
Right.
It reminded me actually of Clockwork Orange. I don't know if you had that in mind.
Yes. I love that film.
Right. When you were describing this, I thought the characters there in Anthony Burgess's book, that seemed to be what was driving them. They almost seemed like, in
Mm-hmm.
that sense, metamodern. I don't know how that works.
Well, my kind of convenient term is, I would say, proto-metamodern.
Right. Okay. Sure, that covers a multitude of sins. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all very intriguing. So, I think, you know, the essay people can read and get some of the nuance, but I just want to clarify that for you, the sort of true roots of metamodernism, if I could put it that way,
Mm-hmm.
are this original essay back in
2010.
2010, by Robin van den Acker
Uh-huh.
and Timotheus Vermeulen.
Timotheus.
Yeah, Timotheus right, Vermeulen, right. And they're professors of philosophy and cultural theory.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they were trying to link this to various cultural artifacts and films and artworks. And the way you put it here, they were swinging between enthusiasm and irony, hope and melancholy, naivety and knowingness, empathy and apathy, unity and plurality, totality and fragmentation, purity and ambiguity. And that this was a sort of new spirit, this insistence that these had to coexist and were
Mm-hmm.
concomitant in some way and always co-arising. I appreciate that, and your essay is sort of filling that out, and your own unique contribution, I suppose, is this notion of what it's for,
Mm-hmm.
functions to safeguard the inner space.
Yeah, although I kind of would say that I get that from another theorist named Raoul Eshelman,
Right.
who around this, actually before Vermeulen and Van den Acker wrote notes on metamodernism, he wrote an essay and then a book called Performatism.
Right.
And it's his own theory of what has come after postmodernism. And he doesn't talk about oscillation between modernism and postmodernism. He specifically talks about, his term is subjectivity, or the subject, the safeguarding of the subject, which he felt that postmodernism eroded.
Okay.
And so he makes observations about films and novels and paintings, etc., that kind of use certain techniques to safeguard the subject.
So I'm just, the analogy that's coming to mind is a little bit lateral, to put it mildly, but I remember reading a book on Zen Buddhism where there's some kind of anecdote in which someone sees a vista and there's two sort of statues there entering a kind of, what would it be, a kind of monastery or probably a temple of sorts. And he asks, who are those statues? And the person replies, they're paradox and contradiction, the guardians of truth. And the reason I thought of that now is that it's almost as if the oscillation between modernism and postmodernism as a kind of a way of being, a sensibility, a form of play, maybe even. Actually, this kind of insistence that you need both, that somehow reality is missing something fundamental if they don't coexist in all their tension, paradox, and ambiguity. That somehow to be in touch with reality most fully is to be in a fairly paradoxical, playful space. That seemed to be partly what I was, the inner space is protected by the play with paradox somehow.
Yeah.
And that if you can't play with paradox, your inner space is vulnerable to capture by either postmodern relativism explaining it away through your context, or modernism explaining it away through your genes and your neurons.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm beginning to get it. Okay, this is exciting. Right, so now that I've sorry, go ahead.
All right, well, I was just going to say that's all, I like all that. And then another kind of angle on it is that what metamodern artworks or cultural art, and I just want to say too, like, you can find this in cultural things that aren't even officially art. Like, you can find this in the slang that people use and the humor that people use.
Yeah.
And on our website, whatismetamodern.com, we have one piece about epic YouTube wedding videos,
right,
where people would stage these productions that were both very serious and didn't take themselves seriously at all,
right,
as either the wedding or the wedding proposal or whatever, and then that would be seen, maybe by millions of people or whatever. Anyway, right. So it happens in the everyday. It's not just the realm of official artists. But what was I going to say? But anyway, so these artworks and cultural artifacts. Another way to look at how the metamodernism works is they kind of inoculate themselves against postmodern ridicule or postmodern ironic skepticism by showing that they get irony.
Right, right.
They can do irony.
They
Like,
disarm their oppressor or something like that. Yeah, they're
yeah,
right.
they're that you can't dismiss them as being kind of naive, old-fashioned, sincere modernists because they fully get irony, but they're not willing to stop and be stuck in the irony.
Yep.
They bring in some very sincere expression at the
Mm.
same time.
Okay. And I was intrigued. One of the things my wife and I have enjoyed watching recently is Fleabag on
Yes.
UK TV, and you use that as a reference point. Tell me a little bit more about why that might encapsulate the metamodern sensibility. I think I can sense it, but I'd like to hear it from you.
Okay, I mean, I'd be kind of curious to hear what you might say.
Well, Fleabag. So I mean, I'll begin by saying, for those who know it, Fleabag is a story in which a youngish woman falls. Well, many things happen to her, but she's implicated in a friend's accident. So there's something serious going on with a friend, and there's a kind of grief there. So there's a real darkness and a quality of loss and sadness, and yet most of it's a comedy. So there's a kind of laughter co-arising with a kind of darkness and regret and guilt. But there's also this playfulness with in later episodes with a priest whom she falls for, and the priest has to choose between her and God. And this is, on the one hand, dealt with great mirth, and she talks about how she can't believe she's going to have sex with a priest, but it's inevitably going to happen. And then it sort of happens, but then he chooses God instead of her. And so the whole thing is these juxtapositions of seriousness and playfulness, and yet the overall tenor is one of being hooked by something real that is true to our experience. And there's a lot of irony in it, a lot of looking at the camera, breaking the fourth wall, and in that sense, meta. And the oscillation, I suppose, is that you care about the character. There's a sense in which what happens to her feels like it matters. It's not a slapstick comedy. You develop real empathy for her, and yet you're also, one of the reasons you're so attracted to the character is that she is full of insight about just how absurd her own predicament is. Something like that. But I'm not a cultural studies theorist. That's just how I see it. Yeah.
I'm really glad that you spoke first, because I think you did great. You said it better than I probably would have.
All right.
For sure. And then just the one thing I would add that's interesting, that you started towards, but you didn't quite get all the way towards, that's interesting about Fleabag, is the breaking of the fourth wall.
Right.
And so, the breaking of the fourth wall is often a postmodern
rather than meta. Okay.
Yeah. And in the sense that in a postmodern usage of the breaking of the fourth wall method,
right,
kind of the purpose is to remind the audience, like, you're just watching a play or you're just watching a movie, and don't take it too seriously, and remember the context and all that.
Yeah.
And my read on Fleabag is that in the beginning, and especially in season 1, her breaking of the fourth wall functions largely in that sort of typically postmodern way.
Right.
But in season 2, there was only 2 seasons, right?
I think so, yeah.
In season 2, there's this interesting moment, and I think it kind of gradually builds, but there's this one really clear moment where the priest notices that she's turning away and talking.
Yeah.
So what we had previously thought of as we had originally thought of the breaking of the fourth wall thing, her asides, because she, and for people that haven't seen it, so this character frequently looks right at the camera.
So Phoebe Waller-Bridge is the actress.
Yeah.
I forget the name of the actual character, but
yeah. We never know.
Right. Oh, really?
Yeah. That's a weird thing about it, is we never know what her name is, and nobody calls her Fleabag either, but we're to understand that somehow she's Fleabag, right?
I see. Okay.
But yeah, so this character played by, and she wrote it too, Phoebe Waller.
I knew that. Yeah.
And I guess it's actually based originally on a one-woman play.
Right.
Anyway, so she frequently turns to the camera and makes these quips or these asides or these observations And as the viewer, you don't think that's really happening in the show,
Yeah, right, right,
in the diegetic world of the show.
right.
You don't. But then suddenly in season 2, the priest at least sees her doing it and comments on it.
Yeah, right. I forgot
And
the episode actually. I can't remember that scene.
yeah, and and there may be some evidence that they actually build towards that by sort of gradually having her asides fit into the reality of the show a
Right.
little bit more. But then when the priest goes, "What are you doing?" It's really
Yeah,
shocking.
yeah,
And and to me, that makes it meta modern,
right.
because um,
It,
go ahead.
well, I think I hear. I think I see where you're coming from. It's something like it would be modern just to have it, right? It would be like presenting it as something true. Postmodern says, hang on, there's a context here, there's perspective here.
Hmm.
By breaking the fourth wall, it says this is a TV production.
Yeah.
You're at home. I'm performing for you. Let's just be honest about the context we're in, right? But then by the priest observing that maneuver,
In the
he
show.
he in effect reifies the performance of it as something real. So it's
Right.
no longer merely a perspective. The perspective has become the reality.
Yeah. And now suddenly her asides, which kind of just seem to function in this kind of superficial way to remind us that we're just doing a show, suddenly now, because what must be happening from the perspective of the priest is she's spacing out
Right, right,
and not listening to him, and what she's doing when she's spacing out is having an interior experience.
right, right, right. So this is
And
again coming back to the protecting of the interior. Right,
yeah, and so now retroactively we reinterpret all the previous looking at the camera and making asides as an actual very serious focus on her interiority, rather than a postmodern
I see.
trick to kind of
Okay.
remind you, like, this is just a TV show, don't
Oh,
take it too
that's great.
seriously.
That's great. That's great. I totally understand. Right. Okay. Good. Right. So we've come to the moment where I want to ask you about alternative perspectives on metamodernism.
Okay.
So in the past, I've been aware of Seth Abramson's
Mhm.
writing and to some extent teaching on this. Would that be aligned with your perspective to some extent? It seems more of a cultural theory view.
Yeah, more aligned than who I think you're about to get to.
Right.
It's more aligned than the people I was addressing in the article.
Okay.
In the article, for those who haven't read it, in the article, I spend the beginning of the article kind of laying out what metamodernism is in the terms that Jonathan and I have been discussing it here, although not into the depth that we've gone in. And then the particular audience for this article, the publication that it's part of, have kind of a general rough interest in something that they sometimes call sense making.
Yeah.
um, and it's this, I'm scared to characterize it wrong, but it's a kind of transformation. It's an interest in sort of transformational perspectives that advance the human condition, advance cognitive development, um, and so kind of what I found was that they've taken up the term metamodernism,
Right.
but are not really using. I don't think they're really using it in this way that I've been talking about.
No, I agree with that. Okay, so leave Abramson to one side because he has his own
Yeah,
quality and definition, and I can see that he's somewhat aligned with you.
it's a lot closer to what we've been talking about than
Right.
these others. Yeah.
But there is also this sort of normative, prescriptive metamodernism.
Mm-hmm.
Many people come across it through Hansi Freinacht,
Mm-hmm.
who is a kind of pen name or alter ego or something. We're not quite sure.
Right.
Combined from two authors. No, I know it's Daniel and Emil. So Daniel Gortz and Emil Freis, I think you say his name.
Okay.
and they've written two books, the Listening Society and the Nordic Ideology. And they, for many people, are the metamodern. They've even got a think tank they call Metamoderna.
Right.
Now I'm interested here in a couple of things. Before we're going right into them, it's also worth mentioning that also in the side view there was a couple of other essays. One by Jeremy Johnson giving a more poetic take on metamodernism. It wasn't really an essay on metamodernism, but it was sort of contextualizing it in a certain sense, and beautifully so, I thought. And Brent Cooper gave a typically thorough overview of different perspectives on the concept, including his own.
Right.
And I know that for many people, there is a view of metamodernism being a kind of political project.
Right.
Before I come to that, I just have one thought that I'll lose if I don't say it now.
Yeah.
But in some ways, what I'm hearing is, if you really want to quickly grasp, prior to the political metamodernism we're coming to now, if you want to quickly grasp metamodernism, is it enough to say it's the emergent property of the relationship between modernism and postmodernism? Or maybe more precise than that. It's the distinct sensibility that arises when one insists on the co-presence and mutually informed oscillating relationship between modernism and postmodernism.
I think that's a way to describe it, and it gets you there.
Right.
But there are other ways you could define it that also get you to the same set of cultural artifacts.
But it's not quite modernism plus postmodernism equals metamodernism. That'd be too simplistic.
Right.
There is something about, if you sort of modernism multiplied by metamodernism, there's something in there where there's a way of making it a little bit playfully formulaic that's still quite close to the truth as an approximation.
Yeah.
Because I think the reason I say that is that while you were talking and you say that's actually makes this postmodern move to break the fourth wall, I'm realizing that, very often a lot of people want to be metamodern as opposed to being postmodern, but actually it's just a big mistake. Like you have to be fully modern and postmodern before metamodernism even becomes an option.
Right.
So you don't have the materials to make metamodernism unless you have those within you, not as things you've like gone beyond, but things that comprise you. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And I realize all sorts of provisos there, but that's just what I wanted to share.
But,
So coming now to Hansi and the sort of normative metamodernism, the idea of metamodernism as a political project. Where are you on that?
Where am I on that?
Yeah. What do you think of it?
Well, I'm kind of uncomfortable with it. Because the difference is not just descriptive versus normative. What the content of what they are kind of advocating for is not the same content as what we're describing when the people kind of in my world use the term metamodernism. So it becomes really confusing. So I mean, and at the risk of reducing a lot out of, but I think that kind of the main areas that are what they're mainly prescribing is that people, our political systems, our educational systems, and everything should take very seriously this developmental stage theory.
Yeah, particularly Michael Commons.
Or Ken Wilber.
Oh, yeah, although they're.
Is that all kind of the same thing?
Well, there's a whole conversation there. I mean, but okay, run with it for now. So developmental stage theory is quite important to them. That's true.
And
why is that not metamodern? Why is that antithetical in some sense?
I wouldn't even say it's antithetical. It's just orthogonal.
Orthogonal, right? Okay.
It's just not. It's not the point.
Right. Okay. So
Yeah.
whatever it is, so the way they would see it, so you're sort of saying, I suppose your question to them would be, look, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not
Yeah.
saying what you're saying isn't relevant. It may or may not be, that's a fine thing. But it's open to you to tell me why what you're doing is in some meaningful sense metamodern.
Yeah. Why is the word metamodern applied or used as the name
Right.
for
So
it?
I think they would say that it's an attempt to give back some kind of norm to actually, they would probably say, and I'm guessing here, but they would say, well, we care about interiority too.
Mm-hmm.
They actually, we believe they have a language of depth, and a language of like internal depth being very important to them, cultural code being the kind of way in which your interiority is influenced by the cultural space. They do speak of stages,
Mm-hmm.
but they are aware that that's only one way of understanding how a person develops.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I think they speak about state as well, about your sort of capacity for transcendent experiences and the extent to which you're high or low. Um, and that would also be interiority. So I think their counter would be, look, we're metamodern because we really believe in the interior life of human beings, and we believe the proactive cultivation of it is the quintessential aim of this historical moment. And we think that's metamodern because, like you, we want to guard that space that's been
Mm.
attacked by modernism and postmodernism. I think
Okay.
that's what they'd say.
Okay. Should I say what I would say?
Sure, sure, of course. And let rip, don't hold
Yeah.
back.
Um, but I think that was a really effective kind of summation of what they might say. Um, so a few things. Which one? Um, but what kind of I end up seeing empirically is when I haven't heard Emil speak much. When I've heard people speak in interviews, it's usually Daniel. So when I've heard Daniel speak on podcasts and such, and he gets asked, like, what would be, and usually the person asking him, their whole idea of metamodernism simply comes from the Hansi Freinecht thing. And the people will say, what would be, is there any such thing as metamodern art? And he doesn't name any of the stuff, the tons of stuff that's been around. He'll speculate and say, well, what it would be, or maybe he'll cherry pick and find like one possible example of some kind of existing cultural
So
artifact.
is your contention, not that you would needlessly personalize it, but just your contention is that from the basis of what you've heard, they don't seem to be well versed in the actual existence of cultural artifacts that are metamodern in nature.
Right, but I'm not assuming it's because they're unaware of them.
Right.
I'm I'm assuming that when they see them, they don't occur to them as metamodern.
I see. I see. I see. So for them, I think, if you might, we spoke about Fleabag. For them, I think what animates them is a sense of a political project that reclaims some normativity and direction.
Mm-hmm.
They see a world kind of hollowed out, a lot of mental illness, ecological collapse,
Mm-hmm.
a kind of failure of governance on an epic scale,
Mm-hmm.
and an inability to really attend to our inner experience adequately. And rather than the society being all about external growth and
Mm-hmm.
uh, a kind of the exterior of progress, they believe in the interior progress. They believe that
Okay.
one can grow in a certain sense and be well, they may not say happier, but they would probably say that people can cultivate their inner lives to have higher state experiences, so they have more transcendence and less like depression and anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
and they can have a more advanced cultural code, so they can live in complex multicultural societies that are technologically advanced and function well within them.
Mm-hmm.
We would say that to try and remember how they put it, but they would want people to grow in mental complexity, mostly because they think that to adapt and survive in the world, you just need that grasp of how things connect,
Mm-hmm.
both in terms of different aspects of the exterior world, so the economy influencing society, influencing politics on the one hand, but also the economy influencing mental states, influencing relationships, influencing education, and so forth. Now, the question then would be, that's fine, and it's all very interesting, but in what way is it metamodern? And I think they would say it's metamodern because it's a concerted attempt to reclaim a normative vision grounded in interiority, precisely the kind of thing that you're trying to protect.
Okay. I don't know if this is a fair move for me to make, but as I said,
By the way, I'm not particularly, I'm speaking on their behalf because I know their books reasonably well.
yeah,
Not because I particularly share or, their outlook necessarily.
no, I know, but they're not here, and,
Sure.
and you're representing them, and I appreciate it.
Trying to, at least, yeah.
Yeah, you're. So let's see, what was I gonna say? Like I said, I don't know if it's fair for me to now do this, but the interiority part, there's a lot of people who theorize metamodernism, and their theory gets them describing the exact same artifacts that I do, but they don't even mention interiority.
I see.
They build it simply on the oscillation between modernist
Right.
and postmodernist. So my question is, although there is something kind of oscillating between modernism and postmodernism in the fictional character, in the playful way they use the fictional character of Hansi,
right,
but the actual content that they're promoting, I don't really see where that is an oscillation between.
Okay, so I think they would say, and my reading of them is that, look, it's modernist because it's about a kind of progress. It's about vision and direction and driving with a kind of rational sense of how the world should be and how we can build it together. In that sense, it's modernist. It's postmodernist in the sense that it's leave no one behind. It's a kind of welfare declaration of the welfare of everyone, and a strategy to achieve it, grounded in a richer understanding of who human beings are. How, and I think the 4 levels, they have depth, codes, stages, and states. And so they're interested in cultivating all those things. And they even have a vision of governance that tries to cultivate them. The reason they would say it's metamodern is the oscillation is, and yes, we are utopian enough to believe that we can try and build a better world. But we're also conscious of the absurdity of that and the utopian nature of that being therefore unlikely to be achieved. They oscillate in the sense that they're aware of the absurdity of that, and that's why they even take on this character of Hansi, who is psychoactive in the way he writes, because he's trying to sort of wake you up to the fact that if you're not going to do this, what are you going to do? Where is your vision of normative progress? The oscillation, I agree, is not yet that clear. There is an inclusivity, there is a perspective, and one of their main underlying theoretical models is the model of hierarchical complexity by Michael Commons. And that is very much about the capacity to integrate quantities of information and different kinds of perspectives when one thinks. And I think their view is that they might see that as a kind of a postmodern movement, because it's inherently perspectival.
Right.
So it's something like that, I think they would say. But I agree with you, they may not be grounded in the cultural understanding of metamodernism as a sensibility.
Yeah.
Their sensibility, I agree with you. Well, yeah, I'm not sure. I think there might be a bit more overlap than you imagine.
No, there may.
Yeah.
And I want there to be. Everything would be easier if it was convincing to me that there was, and that it was, But the other thing I was gonna say was, so this is kind of just a pragmatic question. But although, sometimes they take the effort to call what they do political metamodernism, not
Right.
just metamodernism, and others have sort of on their behalf called it developmental metamodernism or prescriptive, all these things. But the actual real world result is the people who come to the word metamodernism through them
Yeah.
give them ownership of what it means.
No, that's true. But I think that might be a function of the ingenious and somewhat audacious creation of this fictional character, Hansi Freinacht. And look, I've read both books and they're full of red pen, I have all sorts of queries for them and things that don't add up. But I think they've done well to articulate a kind of proto movement that people who are bereft of political vision at the moment can identify with.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm not against sort of like the purpose of their project.
But just to say, I am with you in one sense, certainly, which is that they do write as if metamodernism is a sort of beyond and better than and in some sense superior to what has gone before.
Right.
They speak about pomos in derogatory terms, for example, to mean postmodernists.
They also speak about the originators of the term metamodernism in derogatory terms.
Right. I don't know about that, but yeah, quite possibly. And no, so it's highly problematic, and I don't know how much overlap there is, nor how much I should really be bothered by it. But I mean, I can hear you that if you care about the notion of metamodernism as a distinct, sophisticated sensibility that arises from a deep discernment of cultural artifacts of various kinds, then I can see why someone coming along claiming the mantle of that term for a questionable political venture, like they're doing something out of place.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel. And the other thing I was going to say is, like, let's just, for the purpose of this conversation, suppose that, if we looked at what they were doing, if we hadn't come across what they were doing and it wasn't called metamodernism, it was called something else.
Metamodern, that's interesting.
Let's say I would think of it as metamodern.
Right.
And I'm not saying I do, but let's say that many people, would agree.
Yeah.
But what we would do, but it would have it should have a name. It should have its own name, whether that was Hansiism or listeningism or, whatever it was. And then we might say, oh, look, here's another example of metamodernism. These people have built this incredibly sophisticated, complex system.
So it's an illustration of the cultural pattern that's already there rather than the actual phenomenon.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I think most people I know in my network share that view.
Okay.
That there's a sense in which they've whether knowingly or not, it sometimes looks as though they've subsumed the concept for their own purposes. But that's partly because of the verve with which they took it on. So I have mixed feelings. In some sense, I admire them for that. In another sense, I think it is a bit inappropriate. Not least because I think that there's a depth and sophistication to the kind of work that you've presented about metamodern culture in its modern forms of, by modern I mean here, contemporary forms, yeah. Fleabag we've mentioned, but many others where you can see this beauty in no longer being naive, having gone through the modernist project, having been cultured in postmodernism, and yet now trying to reclaim the dignity of being human with our own soul, so to speak. And with open questions about the meaning and purpose of existence being valid, albeit no longer approached naively. Yeah. And there's dignity in that, which is threatened by a kind of quasi-cultish movement that gets behind two young guys who think they can change the world. So, I see the tensions in it. Good. We've spoken a lot, and we sort of may quit while we're ahead, maybe.
Okay.
There's more to discuss, perhaps, but unless you feel there's something we haven't covered that we should.
I think this is a good ending point, especially, with the possibility that we might speak again.
Sure. And I can maybe meet Linda and just find out a bit more,
Yes.
maybe some more examples of metamodernism in action. And I may also get back to you after I've perhaps spoken to Brent or spoken to Daniel again, or
Great. Yes. Yeah, I would recommend a conversation with Linda
right.
for sure. I think you'd get a lot out of her that I'm not
Okay.
presenting.
Okay, great. I'll try and do that.
Cool.
Well, thanks a lot for joining us. And it's really a tremendous essay. And for those listening, it's in the latest issue of the Side View magazine. And it's called What is Metamodernism and Why Does It Matter? And I think Greg's given a great answer both as to what it is and why it matters. And I hope this video has helped us along the way as well. So thanks a lot, and over and out.
Thanks, Jonathan. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Pleasure, likewise. Thanks a lot for coming.